Hello.
Hello, good evening.
So, are we live and alive? Very well. Thank you very much who joined us today for a fireside discussion. Luckily, we don't have fire, but we did have a little technical crisis. And with the help of Gediminas, we did manage to solve it. So we are live on Facebook, and we will have recordings shared with everyone who registered. So today I have a pleasure to host Jeremie Hitchcock from Dual Use and Defense VC Fund in the United States. The format of this discussion will be, I will very quickly present some highlights, the way we see ecosystem and what we do as Coinvest Capital. Jeremie will also share a few of his slides. Then we will have a discussion. We really look forward for you to participate in that discussion with your questions. And we will stop the fire chat and broadcast at 7. And we can continue networking afterwards for at least 1 more hour. And those who are party animals, there are probably a lot of nice places in Vilnius, and we will not get stuck in the snow. I trust that. So, very briefly, how we see currently numbers in Lithuanian ecosystem in the defense and dual use. Just last year, it was 0. This year, in few coming months, we will have $70 million available for risk capital in dual use and defense. It doesn't necessarily that all this money will go into defense startups, but that's available. So it will really depend on the startups if they are innovative and attractive, and if they will be applying and using those opportunities. And I'll tell you more about this other tempting bigger number that you see also on the screen. So what that $70 million consist of? This slide is in euros. Our fund, we were the first to get fully accredited to invest in defense already back in March 2004. We will be getting 10 extra million shortly, so our available capital to invest will be 24 million. And we have already invested 21 million into 31 startups together with co-investment partners. Then we have Baltic Sandbox Ventures, who is doing deep tech and life sciences, and also part of that is dual use. We have already Acceleration Fund up and running, and we will be closing shortly their bigger fund. Same as with Scale Wolf, a specialized defense VC fund. We do have already, and just graduated, I believe, the second pre-accelerator cohort. And we will also expect to close shortly the bigger fund. So that's what the current 70 million consists of. Now, the other bigger numbers, as you know, Invega, Sovereign National Development Agency, is LP in basically each and every Lithuanian venture capital fund, but also Lithuanian state has contributed through Invega to the NATO Innovation Fund, and there is more and more funds coming. I even haven't updated, but there were some news already this week from Europe, from UK. So as I say, the Europe is waking up finally. Most of you, I hope, have attended. We had a NATO side event with inaugural appearance of a managing partner of NATO Innovation Summit, Andrea Traversone. Recordings of all discussions are also available online on a designated web page, which originally was created for that NATO side event, but we are turning it into more defense VC ecosystem portal. So feel free also to send your news. We will be happy to share them. And very briefly, what we do. We always co-invest under 2 models. Profit sharing model, which is said to be the most generous in the world for accredited private investors. That could be both business angels and also entities, including VC funds that do not have public money in their capital. And we strategically seek to attract more international co-investment partners. In case of success, we will only keep 6% or somewhat similar percent for us, and we will give all the profits away. So if we all are successful together, we have a big honeypot to share. Another option is pari passu with other co-investors. And we are just sector agnostic and evergreen, so we don't have clock ticking behind our back. Now already coming closer to the topic of our discussion, what are the trends in the US, Europe, and Lithuania? We already had several meetings with Jeremie, yesterday and today, and we can continue and share what we discussed in private. But my kind of message is, have we woken up? And just before we move into discussion in Jeremie's presentation, I am very happy that we have John Oman here with us. What Blue Yellow does in Ukraine since 2014 already, with boots on the ground. And we are in fact number 2 as listed on Forbes, NGOs supporting not just victims, but first of all, the soldiers. So if your KPI is to support victims, I don't think that's the right KPI if you want to get peace and end the war. So we have that QR code also next to our networking place. I encourage and invite everyone to get a company, a digital soldier. And now, Jeremie, it's your time to show your presentation. Gediminas, can you help us and put Jeremie's slides on the stage?
Well, good evening, everyone, and pleasure to be here. I'm just going to speak for a couple minutes to give a bit of a background of myself, and then I look forward to continuing our dialogue that we've had over the last couple of days. But for context of myself, currently I work in venture capital, co-founded a venture fund that is in the dual use space, backing companies that are working both in government and in industry. And the thing that I love about it is government, who normally gets this reputation for being slow moving and terrible partners. I think in the world space that we're in, where there's a lot more security, there's a lot more resiliency challenges that are out there, actually the government is a great partner with industry, because the same types of challenges that companies are facing around supply chain, around security, around cyber, around AI, around resiliency, around building hard systems in deep tech, government is actually really good at understanding this multi-decadal view. How do we invest in biotech? How do we invest in robotics? And building a company around that space, around internet, I spent a lot of time building a company called Dyn, which was acquired by Oracle. That's a beneficiary of internet. And the internet was developed in cooperation between US military, academia, and commercial companies. And here we are 75 years later, still unlocking value on this communications platform. So I might be biased, but I've seen the very best of where government, academia, and industry working together can create a tremendous value. Up here I have a bunch of my backstory. By background, I think of myself as a startup entrepreneur, as a builder, as an internet plumber, now living life as an investor. But my start in industry was working on a company called Dyn, which, as I've gotten to know some of you throughout my week so far, you might know it as Dyn DNS. And this was a company that was started in 2001, and it was used for people being able to host content on their home internet connections and be able to move traffic around in real time. You might have had a dynamic IP address and you wanted to host a website, or be able to access a thermostat, or be able to run some type of web service. And so all of that was enabling technology that people were able to build on top of. It was a wonderful journey. I started with 3 other co-founders at the university where I went to school, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Did not think I was going to build a company. And then 15 years later, woke up, and it was a 500-person organization. We were powering literally the Amazons and Twitters and Facebooks, about 30% of the top 1,000 websites, about 20% of the Fortune 500, and just having a great old time. Got to see a lot of interesting internet phenomenon throughout that period of time. Got to work on internet standards, which is run by an organization called the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. They write what's called requests for comments. Those are the internet standards that power HTTP, which is how web servers communicate. They power mail, SMTP, and they also power DNS. And so I know of these as there are RFCs, and there's RFC 931 and RFC 1035, and then there's all these standards that got to work on and be able to contribute to. Also got to work on this interesting organization called ICANN. And so ICANN is the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers. They are effectively the internet regulatory body. And they're an interesting combination of a 3-way relationship between the Department of Commerce of the United States of America, a not-for-profit in California called ICANN, and then an internet company called VeriSign, which is a publicly traded company in the United States. And so from that, and this tremendous trust that exists around the internet authorities and what are called these regional internet registries that hand out IP addresses, which is basically like the digital land that everybody uses. That's how the internet is coordinated, is all of these very loose understandings of trust and authenticity that go into the communications platform that we have. There's no treaty system or anything. It is literally trust. And being in the room and getting to work on some of those standards and some of that cooperation was just a really humbling experience, because you got to see how the internet worked. Had a lot of threats to internet. Could certainly talk about a bunch. And the most famous is a company called, or an organization called WikiLeaks. We made a decision to kick them off our platform in 2010. There were internet attacks. There was this worm called Conficker. There was the Mirai botnet in 2016. I mean, all these very episodic times, and really the trust that we had with our customers was to be able to provide them resiliency. So we'll certainly go into a couple more of those stories. There's some funny ones in there. There's some not funny ones in there. But just had a great time building a company. I wanted to go back to doing 0 to 1 stuff, so the early startup activity. And that was 2016. Decided to leave. Oracle ended up acquiring the company about a year later, and so now what was done is part of Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, is the network pillar. For a bunch of years, was doing a variety of random things. I started a company called Minim, which is currently NASDAQ listed, and then started a distillery, a bookstore, a solar development project, a bunch of other stuff, and also worked on a lot of workforce development activities. Next slide I have is just a little bit about New North Ventures, about what I'm doing now. I got into it. I had through kind of a set of friends, I'd met somebody that worked for the U.S. intelligence community, one of the agencies there. You guys might have heard of the Central Intelligence Agency. My co-founder of the venture fund I'm on, she worked there for about 22 years. Then worked at Palantir. You guys might have heard of that. She was there for about 6 years when they were about 100 people, left when they were about 3,000. And we wanted to build a fund that was focused on increasing the security resiliency. Myself from the commercial and industry background, and her from the more government and public sector side. New fund manager, so we're about a couple years in. It builds on my investing background from my first check I wrote was in 2008. Variety of interesting companies along the way. Not all of them worked. Certainly some good stories around that. But enough of them worked. It's all probability. So if you're thinking about going down that road, just keep investing. Like, it's not for the faint of heart. It will take like 10 or 20 checks in order for you to actually get to a place where you can be good. And I think that there's some scaffolding around here that's actually emerging that's really positive about the ecosystem that lives and works around here. And one of the focus areas, again, there's some parameters on the fund and some of our investments that we've made. Probably the most famous is a company called Hawkeye 360. They're one of 7-8 defense unicorns, at least in the United States. But one of the things that we try to do is really build bridges with the innovation ecosystem that's in the public sector. So some of you might have known of DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit in the United States, AFWorks, SoftWorks, a bunch of these other works things, InQtel, and we're working to extend those type of things. And then this, I think, is a good transition for our discussion, which is really around building ecosystems, which is something I absolutely love. Growing up and building a company that was not in Boston, not in Silicon Valley, I got made fun of a ton of times. And again, I would hang out with a lot of our customers that were in San Francisco, and they would say, "Oh, like, where are you again? Like, do you even can use the internet? Like, you have developers that work there. Like, you guys must still use Telegraph." I mean, like, those are the polite ones. I mean, I certainly have some not polite ones that I'll talk about once a glass of wine gets a little bit more empty. But it was a really, really eye-opening period of time, because it was, I think, one of the first times that people took remote work seriously and the idea that you could build in place. And that theme, I think, has gotten a lot more famous. I'm sure these slides will be available, but there was a really great article that was written about how the city that I'm from was this dirty old mill town. That's how it got referred to. We were a textile mill. We made cotton, took cotton, produced textiles. And it took about 100 years for the city to get over itself and just say, you know what, we should knock it off. We're a really cool, innovative location. We have great workers. We have great companies. And now they're doing a bunch of really cool biotech stuff. So even as a digital person, I feel like I'm obsolete. I'm still trying to get smart enough about biotech. But really, ecosystems are about relationships, and they're about people coming together and working to solve problems. No matter how much technology or innovation goes into a company, it's still a group of people who are working on solving a common problem. And so it's something I hope that none of you ever forget. It's networking groups, it's people-to-people communication. I have a set of skills that my co-founder, my co-partner does not have. And so every day we're learning from each other. We're working and challenging each other and trying to get better. The other thing that I think is interesting to learn is entrepreneurs are the first-class citizens. And this was written by a person named Brad Feld. You guys might know of Techstars, and so the person behind Techstars is a guy named Brad Feld, and he built a technology ecosystem outside of Boulder in Denver, Colorado in the United States. And he wrote this book called Startup Communities. Really interesting read. But if you don't want to read it, or if you don't want to ask ChatGPT to give you a summary of it, basically first-class citizens are entrepreneurs, everybody else second class. Like the people who build the ecosystem are the people who are running the startups. They're the co-founders. They're the people that are thinking about expansion. They're thinking about being able to land customers. They're thinking about the jobs that are going to get created. And everyone else, and I say this as a venture capitalist now, I'm a second-class citizen. I'm not hiring people. I'm not I'm writing checks and that money goes to go hire people, but I'm there with the accountants, the attorneys, like all the other people. And so it's something to think of is that all the answers are basically in the founders' heads, the problems that they have. Go ask them how to make the ecosystem better. They'll have 5 or 6 things that they'll probably say, hey, this could be better, this could be better, this could be better. Go work on solving those problems. And the last thing before we turn things over, because a bunch of you have asked, like, how do I connect with the United States? And I'll leave a couple of venture capital firms that I think are more open for feedback. Like, we're not an unfriendly bunch. We love to meet new people, and you guys might think, oh my gosh, I'm in Lithuania, like I'm some US-based venture capital, like I'm gonna email them and they're gonna put me on some sort of blacklist. I'll never get funding ever from the United States. Like, that's not the case. We're a pretty friendly bunch. We're just like any other sets of organizations. Like, you're gonna get a bunch of no's, but you'll probably get some pretty interesting advice and color about if and how to expand your business, and whether that means expansion in different marketplaces, further in Europe, Asia, United States. You'll get some different perspectives. You also get some different perspectives about how to build product, and not to build components, but to build platforms that are more valuable. Can certainly get into some more technicalities on investing and cross-investing, whether they're done through safes or co-investment or Delaware flips or a bunch of other mechanics. We could certainly get into that. Probably need a little bit more wine in order to go through there. And the final thing is, like, please keep in touch. My email address is up there. I'll stay here afterwards, and we'll hopefully trade LinkedIn details or whatever else. But look forward to a conversation and getting to know some people. So thanks so much. And looking for this dialogue, Viktorija.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just before we take a sip and just before we start a discussion, I would like to thank Apolinaras Sinkevičius. He is Lithuanian, living in the United States for many years, and he is very much active promoting our ecosystem and building bridges. So, as you mentioned, your personal story, I hear a lot of similarities, and because we are kind of bootstrapping the ecosystem in a way, coming from small in size but big in heart, and ambition, and being hungry to catch up for what we have missed during Soviet occupation. So we really look forward to this discussion, and we really look forward to more developed ecosystems to copy with pride, learn from the best tips and tricks, and learn also from the lessons. So maybe let's resume. Let's start this discussion from your insights. What makes this investment in defense and dual use special, and how you approach that? My kind of introductory quote would be that in addition to traditional risks that you have by investing in startups, which is a very high risk asset class, even if you have traditional VC risks, even if you have known risks investing in, for example, medtech, which has government or government-owned organizations and as your key clients with lengthy procurement cycles, defense is even more than that, in addition to those aspects, you have much longer procurement cycles, and you also have a secrecy, which is a natural thing if you want to be safe. So how to work in that environment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that's asked a lot. People look at government, and I certainly know a lot of other venture capitalists that look at government and say, my gosh, if you're a startup and you're selling to government, I don't want to talk to you. And there's still, I think, a majority of venture capital firms and financing sources that's true. They want to avoid that. But I look at the positives of a customer who, unless you really badly screw up, you probably won't get replaced. So there's a loyalty aspect. They're also working on I think, the most interesting tip of the spear problems. So the challenges that government is trying to field in terms of, we can think about war in Europe, not that far from here, and the innovation and the cycles of innovation and the speed in which new things are getting fielded. I mean, it's lights out fast, probably faster than industry in some ways. Know some friends who were over there over the summer helping some of the drone companies, and they talk about these weekly innovation cycles. And that's not normal even in industry where you have software, maybe you're on a similar construct, but it's super fast. So I think there's, for problems that matter, speed does not get in the way. There's ways in which there's more rapid acquisition vehicles, and there's a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation. I think a lot of action that's taking place. I could say that at least in the United States, where again DIU, AFWorks, SoftWorks, but also the Intel community and also the Special Mission Unit community is much quicker at fielding things. I think in Europe, NIF certainly gets a lot of credit for still getting off the ground. They're figuring it out. Knowing some people who are working on it, there's a lot of learning that's going into how to deploy capital. And it's probably this year will be the first year that they're making some real investments, and that'll be an exciting thing to see. But it's also, I think, a platform shift where it takes a while for government to kind of gear up. But one of the advantages that government has is it can scale. It can deploy a huge amount of capital in a very short amount of time and do so in an efficient manner. Will there be things that they get wrong? Yeah, and actually I hope they do, because those are going to be the learning lessons. And if you're not pushing, you're not going at that right speed, and you make no mistakes, you're not pushing fast enough and hard enough. I also like all the non-dilutive funding that exists inside of government in terms of research and development grants. Many of the companies, and I've heard of the past couple of days I've been here, that's been a wonderful strategy that companies are able to do research and development, build a company at the same time. And so they're able to do that in a much more capital efficient manner, which investors love. And I think it's a reason why we're not the only fund in the United States that's doing dual use. There's probably 6, 12, maybe even 20, 30 funds that are either completely focused or at least involved in this dual use ecosystem. And 10 years ago, maybe it's a couple, maybe it's 4. So I think there's an emerging category that's being recognized that this is a good place to invest.
Yes, it's definitely emerging category, at least in Europe. But if you remember in one of the slides that I showed, there was a kind of peak in, I believe it was 2001, and then a drop for 22, and of course figures for 23 were not final, so we can't make conclusions on that. But with dip, how you see that? What trends do you see from your perspective in US? Are investments slowing down or they are accelerating? Because if you read the headlines, there is an overall contraction in available VC capital. Although, if you look at the averages, so you can see a healthy person if you take an average of a corpse and someone in the emergency room. So how do you see trends? What's happening? Is capital coming in or leaving in US? And I have a question for later.
Oh yeah, it's we always love looking at the trends and understanding what's going on, and the crystal ball is really tough to look at. It's hard to guess where things are going. The thing that we usually say is that the amount of funding is probably at a more sustainable level. If you guys remember 2020, 2021, everybody's sitting at home, there's nothing going on. There's probably an over-exuberance in deal activity. And so I liken to think that 2021 was probably the end of kind of a crazy time. And definitely watching a lot of fellow friends and peers in the space that are trying to raise funds, and they're in some ways being unsuccessful in that journey. But I also see the health of companies that are raising capital in potentially a more austere time, and everybody is trying to guess, are we going to go into recession or not recession, or is growth going to happen, is growth not going to happen? But I look at our portfolio companies, and they're doing well. It's tough work. They're trying to innovate. They're getting contracts. They're being able to be successful in building. So at least in some sort of microcosm, there's success going on. And I think one of the things that we're excited about is that GDP, for the most part, kind of globally, is still consistently going up. And there's lots of transformation going on. And so if you are a startup and you're fundamentally trying to sell products in a changing environment, you're going to do well. And I think for entrepreneurs, they might look at the numbers and they might say, hey, there's less capital going in, but the whole late stage market has basically disappeared for a couple of years. Maybe that comes back later this year, maybe it comes back next year, but I think early stage is still pretty active. There's still a lot of activity going on. Deals are getting done. It's a little bit harder. Valuations are probably not, they've come down some, but they're probably not going down anymore or much more from where they are. So I think it's still a wonderful time to build companies.
Well, you mentioned that the change is taking very rapid place, and so many things are developing, and those innovation cycles are shorter and shorter. It might sound cruel, but with the war happening so close to our borders in Ukraine, we have a unique laboratory, real live settings to test all sorts of innovations. Everything is needed yesterday. Quantities are unlimited. And Lithuania having, many long historical relationships, also cooperation on political and economical, on the military side, even, some special operations that are not public. We've been discussing also with some ecosystem players in US and UK that Lithuania is uniquely positioned to also test inventions or products under development from other countries, because we have our own ways to get them fast to the front lines. And even Blue Yellow that I mentioned, and maybe Jonas will comment later himself. This is a unique model of cooperation, and Blue Yellow being NGO on one hand, funded by volunteers, by private citizens, they are one of the buyers of innovations. What is, from your perspective, do you see that original or unique potential positioning? I mean, we chatted earlier today, and I mentioned that a few years ago, Lithuania have chosen to become a fintech center. So all stakeholders, all ecosystem players cooperated, joined forces, changed the laws we needed, and we kind of became a fintech center, at least a very big and notable player in the field. Can we do the same in defense? I mean, we probably won't be producing tanks, although I have still a dream to drive an actual tank, if somebody's listening. But, we do have some strengths where we can build on and find some synergies, from lasers to telecommunications to IT, cybersecurity, even, biotech, which has so many applications in defense. So, outsiders' view, fresh eyes, what would be your tip and advice how Lithuania can position itself in the world?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to answer that, and there's multiple ways to be successful. I was looking at PitchBook, and PitchBook's not the ultimate source for deal activity, because I was curious on trends. There were about 8,000. So Boston is a similar population of Lithuania, and there were about 8,000 VC deals that took place in Boston last year, and there's maybe
I don't know,
30, 40, 50.
Maybe.
So 20x difference if I do the math right there, and the amount of funds was in Boston it was about 15 billion, and here it was probably 100, 200, and maybe that's generous, smaller, lower, but that's which
we are growing fast and ambitious way.
Yeah, small. Yeah, exactly. Very very fast growth. Fastest growing, right? In all Europe. Yeah, well, it's not. Well, and there's great. I think there's great universities in Boston. There's great universities here. I got to learn that the first lasers were turned on here 50 some odd years ago, and there's a wonderful ecosystem around photonics and laser technology. So I mean that's a really cool heritage to build on. And so I think it shows the capacity of people to be productive. And it's not to say that, oh my gosh, Boston produces 100 times the more venture capital dollars, because that's not what the comparison's supposed to show. It's there to show the opportunity that exists to not just think about how do you 10% more, but how do you 5x or 10x yourselves over not just 1 year, 2 years, but over 5 or 10 years. And compounding and recycling of capital is one of those things that is a very powerful thing. I think most people probably, if you've ever taken a microeconomics course, that you learn the power of compounded interest, and it is a very powerful force, because things over multiple years really pay off. I'd invest in the things that are working, and I got to spend some time with the Ministry of Economic, hearing about some of the mill fund and some of the co-investment and the way that they view it. And that's actually very progressive for a lot of countries and a lot of even states in the United States, in terms of being able to put funds to work in risk capital environments, because they typically say, well, we can't own equity, and we don't want to touch that risky part. We'll loan money, we'll loan capital, but it's going to be asset backed and highly secured. And so the fact that you have programs like what you're running, I think is a real testament to the opportunity dreaming that people are doing. The other thing I think of in specialization and trying to take the tens of thousands of people that work in the startup community here is how to expose them to the greater world, and not to the sense of them going off and disappearing, but them being exposed to what is the art of the possible. I ran a company that sold products and services to people that are outside of New Hampshire, and I could have gone to San Francisco, but I didn't. And there were, I think, advantages for us to be where we were. And so I think being able to learn from other geographies, whether it's whole of Europe, North America, Asia, it's a global market space. And so the products that you make here can go anywhere. And it's really understanding how to invest in those aspirational goals, one or two of those, and be laser focused on, no pun intended, but be laser focused on those goals. And I'm trying to get the audience to warm up a little bit. Be focused on those goals, and knowing that you just have to do what you're doing every day a little bit better. So you have to do that continuous work, build companies, try to get them to the next phase, one more every year, but also have that long-term mindset of, is the right thing to add another industry geography. And I think that I've certainly heard about the fintech side. That was anybody's opportunity. And so some smart people and some entrepreneurial people here said, you know what? We're going to go figure out how to make this happen. We're going to go be the best at fintech, and we're going to understand the rules and the regulations and the technology, and we're going to organize the workforce together, and we're going to seize the opportunity. And in a very dynamic world, it is going to take somebody who isn't going to ask for permission. They might tick some people off along the way, but what's going to happen is that they're going to take advantage of things that other people will not.
Thanks. Going abroad, even pitching to investors, you really have to be able to tell your story in an easy and understandable way, and also fast. We have this joke with Apollinaris. I observed, 2 startups pitching, so we now have a kind of internal battle competition, who will be the winner. So it took one startup 39 minutes to tell what we are actually good at. Another startup, it was 35. I saw Apollinaris posted a challenge on LinkedIn, who will make it to the 5 minutes. We did, great. So you'll tell me the winner later. I'm curious and interested. But it's a little bit also like a cultural thing. I'm in mergers and acquisitions. I did so many transactions. We have excellent entrepreneurs, but for a variety of reasons, culture, history, geopolicy, mentality, even religion, people are kind of shy. And if you speak what you are good at, it's considered, bragging, arrogance, or whatever. But you have to attract interest and make your innovation known. What would be your advice, from your portfolio experience, from your personal experience as founder of successful companies, especially, for example, everyone, I guess, would be dreaming about selling to US consumers, one of the largest single market, truly single, although you have states with regulation. So what is the tip and trick for Lithuanian startups to sell to prime contractors, I guess, or to the military?
Oh, lots of questions in there. I mean, the first is, if you know of, there's a personality assessment score called the Myers-Briggs, and one of the assessments on it is introverted or extroverted. So I actually score as an introvert. And as an engineer myself, took a long time to be able to get to that place. And the joke they would have is the difference between an extroverted engineer and an introverted engineer was whether I looked at your shoes or I looked at my shoes. The introverts, they look at your own shoes. Like, I can't even look at her shoes, let alone look at her in the eye.
I have my heels and standards high.
Yeah. But it's when you get passionate, and I think of this as more technically oriented, engineering-based founders, and so I'm kind of speaking to that audience. I think for them, it does take a while to be able to be comfortable saying, hey, this is a product I have, and it can solve a problem that you have. And so by partnering together, I'm able to create value. And it was interesting because it probably was a good number of years in my career that I realized that as an engineer, you always look for metrics to measure how effective, how much faster, how much better is a particular product or a service. And actually, I got comfortable at some point with the fact that dollars were a way I could measure the effectiveness of a product or a solution. Understanding that a company is spending money on something, whether it's indirectly competitive, and so they're losing, some sort of opportunity cost, or I could actually replace another product with something that was 10x better. So my product was more valuable. And that was suddenly a way that I got comfortable with the idea of talking about money. And I still, still not my favorite thing. I mean, even Apollo was beating me up because I don't typically put Dyn was acquired by Oracle, and there's a rumored price for how much it was valued. Punchline, not a unicorn, but more than $1. And it was a great outcome for myself and for about 30 some odd people on the team in terms of number of kind of retirees that were formed at the acquisition. But that scorekeeping I don't particularly care for. But the scorekeeping I do care for is we built a product that people bought, and it saved them a lot of things. So I think it's a comfort of just getting over it. I think that's one of the areas that I see that's interesting here is that the culture of chief marketing officers, business development people, salespeople, I think that's still an emerging craft here. And that partnering around co-founders, because here, the co-founders I've met, you have the CEO who's highly technical, and then you have the CTO who's even more technical. And I think what will happen as time goes on is that there'll be a wider team, and you typically have, I think, an interesting product and an interesting go-to-market approach, and that's what makes successful companies. So in terms of advice or counsel, that's one of them. For primes, how do you talk to primes, or how do you get into the U.S. market entry? I think it depends. I think a lot of people want to find a channel reseller. They're like, I just want to pass it off to somebody, and it might be the easy thing in the moment, but that's not how you build a really large scalable business. You need to go direct, especially if you're changing the way in which people are either buying a product or using a service. If you have something, if you can sell a glass for 10x cheaper, or it's 10x stronger, you can probably use a distributor. But a lot of people are doing things that are just fundamentally different. They're emerging. There's some sort of enabling platforms or enabling technology, and those are really tough to sell as a reseller. It has to be something that's much more direct, and that's, I think, one place where whether it's foreign capital or it's venture capitalist people, they can help you dream bigger about how and what's the best way to go to market.
You mentioned a few keywords that I will build my next question on. Unicorns. We also spoke today about unicorns, and we kind of came to the conclusion that probably overall in defense there will be 6 to 7 unicorns at all globally. We'll see, the future will show, but there are all sorts of other animals in that field, and trade sale or merger acquisition is also a good option. Now the other thing you said, you are engineer. I'm a financial strategist. Again, tell me your tricks. How to recognize a good startup? I mean, the difference between genius and jerk. Because, I mean, if innovation is very new, so who is that expert who can actually tell that this is a good thing? How you assess innovativeness?
Sounds like we'd be a good pair. I mean, you're a strategy person, tell good stories. I just think
We could co-invest. I look forward to that. And we have some great startups in the room.
Look at that. That was a softball. No, I look forward to it.
I can sell.
I think one of the ways that we look for signals that a product is good. I mean, being a company builder ourselves, myself and my partner, like we kind of have a sense of what works, what doesn't work. And we were joking about how long does it take to get a founder to say, like, what do you actually solve? And a lot of times there's this bearing of technical detail, like, I'm going to prove to you that this works. And I actually think that venture capitalists are some of the most optimistic and like gullible people on the planet, because like we want to believe. We go around and we want to believe what a founder is saying, and we typically do because we don't know everything about every discipline of science. We try to be curious. But usually people who understand their craft, they're credible, they can tell a story, and they can also simplify it. If you think about a professor or a teacher, they probably have to have a great level of understanding of a subject in order to be able to in order to teach something. And really, if again, I speak from my own personal kind of due diligence process. If you can understand what's going on and be taught a science in a short period of time, and it's usually through customer value, because again, that scorekeeping has to be there. Again, I can believe that, hey, this table is made of the finest wood and it's whatever, but unless there's a customer value that's attached to it, and again, we're gullible, so we don't really need a lot of help and coaching to say, oh, okay, there's this many tables that exist, and there's this many whatever, and this is how cheap it is to make or how expensive to make. Unless we can understand that, we typically can't do ourselves justice for either ourselves or our limited partners to be able to put capital to work. And venture is not the only funding source, and so that's one of the things I also think about in the defense ecosystem is, at some point, I believe there's going to be other flavors of capital that come to work. Whether it's venture certainly has certain expectations for a venture fund that invests in 10 companies. They need one company to be a unicorn, and they need 9 to be a write-off, and that's okay. I think in the dual use ecosystem, there's going to be a lot less write-offs because companies, generally speaking, are providing value earlier, and so they may not be they won't be a write-off. They're not going to produce 10x. But maybe they're like a couple times, which is great because we get to know a founder, they get to learn a lot of lessons, and we're probably one of the first phone calls that they make on their second company or their third company, and that I think is success, because unicorns are not the measure of success. And maybe I say this because Dine was not a unicorn, so I don't want to lump myself in the failure category. Maybe someday I'll go back to building companies. I'll try for that, but there's multiple ways to succeed in this game, and solving interesting problems that affect society, I think, is one of the things that we find the most rewarding.
Thank you. 2 more questions, and I will open the floor to questions from the public. So first thing is, you like mentioned that VCs are putting a lot of trust on the founders, knowing that this is a risky business. I like what the General Gronsky said when he was he said that in his book, but when we met a few weeks ago, read people more than reports. And then there is another guy, well, he's not with us anymore, Stephen Covey. I had the pleasure actually to learn from him personally. He has even the book, At the Speed of Trust. So again, what would be your tip to build a trust-based dialogue of the ecosystem with military? I mean, military has to be a part of the ecosystem in order to really create, as you said, something which is valuable for the customer, not just works by itself. We really need to, we as ecosystem, as startups, first of all, we really need to hear the needs from military. And there is this thin line, secrecy and the future outlook, actual needs, and we need not to tell, about that. So how you approach that, how your startups approach that, how your ecosystem builds the dialogue?
Yeah, it's still a work in progress. Trust, and I'd harken this back to the earlier statement. Ecosystems are based on relationships and people, and so as much as there's technology that is behind something, it really is a people. It's a trust. I think one of the challenging things that entrepreneurs who have not had contact with government or military do not appreciate is if you're building or fielding a product and you're out at the edge, you're in a wartime conflict, and something goes wrong, somebody gets hurt, they die. Like, and those are real consequences. And in traditional technology companies, like you get something wrong, and maybe I'll pick on ad media companies, like an advertisement doesn't load. Nobody cares. There's a little bit less money that gets paid out, and like, you know, somebody gets maybe yelled at, or like, oh, the score goes from 100% to 99.9. Like, no, that's not, it's a different consequence. As a founder and as a person who enjoys high performance cultures and building that trust, like that's a speed I'm okay with. And knowing that when somebody on the other end of the table is saying, I need something that's going to go do this, it's going to go do this, and it's going to go do this, and it needs to be delivered by this date, have these attributes. And if I can deliver that, they're happy, they're able to do what they need to do, they're able to live, they don't get hurt, and there's a huge amount of trust. But to get to that point does take a lot of back and forth. You know, a funny story that I remember, again, this goes to the secrecy. I was at an event, and there was a government contractor that, or government acquisitions person asked, I was moderating a panel, and they asked a question, and they said, hey, there's a bunch of companies that are here. They're all these 30, you know, they're all great, but there's 5 I want to buy from, and I can't buy from them today. It takes 2 or 3 years I'll be able to get around to like getting the acquisitions thing the right way. How do I make sure that they survive until then? And like the way that the culture is based is like they can't say who they like, and they, you know, a whole bunch of secrecy things. And my literal question back was like, just tell us who it is. And of course the audience laughs because you know you can't do that. And I think that there's still this fundamental back and forth that culturally we're trying to figure that out. I think over the next 5 or 10 years, that's going to be a solved problem, because it's not a secret what are the general types of challenges and issues that government's trying to solve. Like that's all probably pretty well said and done. Like if you were producing a general drone for at least the U.S. military, I can speak about the U.S. military. Like don't even try. Like they got that. They got that figured out. If you can do a special widget that does, you know, a set of characteristics, like that's more interesting. But they got that common platform. So it's a lot of listening. It's a lot of patience. We think that we try to do a good job of understanding what that audience is looking for, and we try to help our companies be able to say, is this useful, is this not useful? And companies that we get exposed to that are solving a problem that we know that a government agency sponsor is interested in, we try to make that connection. It'll get better, but as a person who sold to fintech and pharma companies, like they're no walk in the park either to sell to. They take a long time. They have whatever ridiculousness about how they do procurement. So I actually don't think government is as bad as a customer as people say they are. If you're selling a tank, good luck. Like that's hard. Like that stuff is like a 7-year program. It's stupid ridiculous. But I mean, I've seen stuff that is literally like first contact to being fielded, and there's a contract in place. I've seen that stuff in weeks and in short number of months. And maybe that's a little bit more the exception than there is the rule, but it's getting better, and I think it's going to continue to get even more and more accelerated.
Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned, you know, this dialogue with MOD, you know, and the question, will we survive in a few years? Because I had exactly the same discussion with our MOD leaders, and, you know, my answer was, this is a chicken and egg problem. If you will not buy, startups might not survive. So if you want to build local defense industry, defense innovations, you have to chip in, as simple as that. Overall, regulations. Again, you know, we spoke this morning, and we kind of agreed that so many things are changing at so big pace. We have a major, like never ever in history, so many democracies had elections happening this year. So, I mean, we'll see what will happen by the new year. And then, you know, we will be inventing the bicycle as we ride it, because we definitely need to feel the sense of urgency, if it's not already too late, but it's never too late. Regulation. Aren't democracies losing because of the regulation? And here even I would say, isn't Europe in particular losing with so many requirements? if at this point we still have discussion whether it is socially responsible to invest in defense, I mean, what are we talking about? And even let's take, for example, facial recognition or expression recognition. China has 1 billion market. I mean, yes, Chinese people are different from people, majority of let's say, in Western part of the world. They don't have those regulations, so the technology will develop much, much faster, and we will be put at a disadvantage because to a certain extent technology is universal, at least the technical part. The data might be different. What do you think? Regulation versus over-regulation. Is it a base for sustainability, or is it a barrier and in fact a major mistake?
I'm not a political scientist, but I generally will put my money on a free market democracy any day. I think that the resiliency that exists in democratic societies and free market societies is generally one that is really strong. There's certainly a whole bunch of, whether you go back to any empires that have risen and fallen, the Egyptians, the Romans, like you can kind of keep going on. And they get to a place where, like, why do they recycle? And that's an interesting question, which I don't have a good answer for. But I've listened to a few podcasts that have gone through some of those reasons. And is overregulation a part of that? Could be. Don't know. I do think that the resiliency that exists in free market economies, though, has the opportunity to think of being able to cull regulation and pull back on things that are not working, and be able to reintroduce or introduce new ideas. I mean, I think about the United States versus the Soviet Union, and you really had an idea about a centralized economy versus a free market economy, and at least one person's perspective, but free market economy won in that realm. And you think of even in dual use, we were talking about this earlier today, the space program, which could be looked at as an interesting military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Who's going to build the biggest rocket to get somebody to the moon first? And when you go back and look at the discussion about like who was against that, what was the pushes and pulls, really in the United States at least, it was sold as a jobs program. It was around economic development. It was about research and development. John F. Kennedy was going around the country and selling it as a jobs bill. As I'm going to put research centers here. We're going to go do basic fundamental scientific work here, and that's going to turn into industry. And looking back 50 years later, or 60 years later, that was a good investment. And I think that those bold ideas, in some ways, we're missing some of that. But I'm also, I think, optimistic about biotechnology, about what's going on in our understanding and kind of fear of losing democracy, and trying to think of like what are the important tools that we need. How do we think about AI and doing AI the right way? The United States is doing some stuff around AI regulation. Europe's doing some things around AI regulation. You guys might actually be a little bit better on the AI regulation stuff than the United States is right now, but no one's keeping score on that. But I do think that with so many free markets and democracies around the world, there's a learning lesson. There's a set of learnings that need to go on. I live in the United States, kind of by. I think we do some great things. I think there's some stuff that we're messing up. Hopefully, working on making those things a little bit better. But I think that in one case, again, government has this wonderful scale. So when it identifies a challenge, and it's usually driven by the people, then it can muster its resources in a way that's just tremendous and just awe-inspiring. And so, again, I still have that optimism that working together under a common set of mission and goal, that we're able to make the world a safer and more prosperous space. So, yes, I worry about regulation. I think about privacy a lot in the application of technology. I happen to live in New Hampshire, which very privacy centric. Our state motto is "Live Free or Die," and that's something that the population, the electorate, take very seriously. And it's I think a helpful theme when we're thinking about aggregating data together. And as a result, you see a lot of democracies that have really kind of pushed away from facial recognition in a very societal approach. There's probably tactical applications that make sense, but by and large, I think that's a really good decision. I think that's a mistake, and that other countries like China have decided that we're going to have facial recognition everywhere. You can only play video games for a couple. My son reminds me of that. Like in China, we have a really good way of life here. In China, you can only play video games on like Friday and Saturday from like 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And that centralization, I think, not allowing personal freedoms, I think, really backfires on societies.
Freedom is good. Speaking of luxury, I have a saying, past luxury was money, current luxury is ability to manage your time. Next, or even current luxury is privacy. But we do have some minutes in our planned period for broadcast and recording, so we can continue off-the-record discussions during the networking session. But now I am ready to give a mic for someone who wants to give a question for the record and for our broadcast viewers.
Thank you. This is such a treat sitting here listening to you and your experience. I'm interested in corporate venture capital. And tell me, first of all, in your experience when you sold your company to Oracle, had you been invested in by Oracle's venture capital arm? How did that kind of work? And then also, bringing that to defense, what do you think is happening in the corporate venture capital world vis-a-vis defense, and how important is that in the journey?
Yeah, so corporate venture is I think a great mechanism. It's United States, I can speak to it. There is, I think, a huge emergence of venture capital in the corporate CVCs is how they get talked about. I'll answer them kind of reverse. Maybe eight of the top 10 defense contractors in the United States have a venture capital firm that's kind of inside of their organization, a CVC, or one that they have outsourced to another entity. In fact, one of them has two, which is kind of an interesting flavor. But they have different missions. They're all snowflakes, and they're all trying to do something, whether it's for the company itself. Raytheon probably is the best example. You have to be doing something kind of in the Raytheon ecosystem, but it's very light touch, and they're fantastic. They talk to anyone. They're fantastic people that way. Another one is Lockheed Martin has a venture arm, and they're a little bit more disconnected from corporate. They're kind of run a little bit more independently than the Raytheon one. Different goals, different missions, but I think that they're both trying to figure out like what's the right way that they can encourage the corporate aims that both those organizations have. A lot of the FANGs or the big web accelerators, the web techs, have venture capital firms. Oracle, the time that we invested, did not have a CVC. We were doing a little bit of work with Oracle, but did some co-selling together. So it wasn't in our journey, but certainly talked to a bunch of companies who were doing some of that work, and ultimately none of them invested in us, but got comfortable with that model. And they all have different modes, and so when you think of CVC and you think of another CVC, they have completely different goals. Like we look and feel pretty similar to other early stage investors, but the CVCs all have very different goals and aims. So I'd encourage founders to understand what and why the mission is of those. They will gladly tell you because that's what they're there to do. And they're basically corp dev people that have a balance sheet that they can invest on.
Thank you. Next was Marius, and then I saw Yoni.
Thank you both for this discussion. Jeremie, you talked about your background a bit in the beginning and mentioned that you bootstrapped the company for 10 years. So maybe you can talk a bit more about that. I think a lot of founders here relate to that. And also, do you think it was easier back in the day than it is to do now, or is it still the same?
Oh my gosh, it's so much easier today. I mean, if you want to launch a company, you can do it in like a weekend. And I think of the things that I spent weeks on: credit card processing, setting up a website, getting a mail address, like setting up corporate, like all that stuff just took so much time. And nowadays it's like easy. So it's a lot easier today. There's a lot less excuses to be able to run a company today than it was before. There's a lot more written online too. So there's a lot more, I think, peers. I mean, there's no software as a service. Like that business model just like wasn't even talked about, wasn't coined. So there's a lot of things I think that are easier about today than there were back then. And that I think is again, it's a more common thing. Like I was doing an internet company when I was in college. So what did my parents think I was doing? I was doing something on the internet. They thought I was doing adult entertainment. And like, good power to those people that do that. And actually we met some people that were in that line of work, and like they had some great technology stuff to learn from because they managed data effectively. So I mean, again, there's some interesting learning lessons there. Like be curious, like maybe not too curious in that area. And then as far as the the bootstrapping, like the nicest thing about bootstrapping is that you have this customer connection that is unrivaled, because your next paycheck, your food that goes on the table is customer funded. So you're very frugal, you're very efficient. Our first 10 years were like that. We were about 30 million in revenue when we first took outside capital, which largely was secondary. It was a stock repurchase for one of my co-founders. And they're different models. Like I remember somebody who's now a partner at A16Z. We were having a drink one time, and he was like, "Oh man, I really want to run a company. It's bootstrap." I kept saying, "Oh, I want to run a company that's like venture funded and see what's different about it." And you just prioritize time versus efficiency, and that is really your trade-off between the two. I think it's a lot easier also today to be customer funded. You can get letters of interest. You can get people to advance you capital. I think big companies are more comfortable working with startups and innovative companies. It takes work. It takes putting yourself out there. You're going to get a lot of no's, but I think it's a road that a lot of people don't think of. They think, oh, I have to look for a tender and I have to respond to the tender, and like maybe I get accepted and maybe not. But that business development mindset of being able to go and be customer funded from kind of day one, I think that some of the best companies that I know are able to go to aspirational customers, are able to, from day one, maybe not get 100% of the business they want to get, but they'll be able to get a big book of business or big enough to get them started, and they can use that to then go get some other engagements someplace else.
Well, I think your parents were right. You kind of do adult entertainment when you own a distillery, but we have a third question here.
Thank you. Thank you, Viktorija and Jeremy. It's a lovely discussion. So if we are going VC path, it's quite often that VC is looking from startup venture scale. Is it scalable? What is the opportunity? And on the other side, when we are selling to enterprise and super enterprise government, we see quite often exclusivity requirements. So what's your take on exclusivity requirements, especially with dual tech? What's your piece of advice for that?
Yeah, dual use exclusivity is definitely an interesting question, and context matters a lot there. Again, trying to put yourselves in the shoes of government, and a lot of times they're trying to field something that's going to be out there for a 10, 20-year period, and so they're looking for security on their business of they want to make sure that you're loyal to them. And I think understanding what the exclusivity arrangement is and the why is really important. There's a lot of technical ways to kind of solve for that. There's escrowing of intellectual property. If there are data sets involved, that also works pretty well. There's different licensing agreements or trying to carve things out of most favored nation. It's really trying to understand, like, what is that exclusivity agreement trying to get at? And then understanding, which that sometimes is not easy to get to, because there might be like lots of riddles that are woven into why they're asking for exclusivity, and the first answer may not be the actual real answer that they're trying to get to. So being able to kind of work around that. In the defense-oriented businesses, I've actually found that some attorney people are actually pretty savvy about what different agencies are trying to ask for when they're looking for exclusivity. And some of them are actually about literally control. They're like, we don't want you to get to be too big of a company, because then we don't have as much of a voice in how you develop your roadmap. And that's sometimes a cost of doing business in the government space. And you have to evaluate whether or not that makes sense or not. Corporates, I find it's much more about a rivalry with a specific company. It's pretty common knowledge that IBM and Oracle, they don't like each other. They're rivals. And so if you can show up to an IBM negotiation with an Oracle offer, and I say this kind of in just how they think about each other. Maybe this is too close of a personal example, because this did not happen in our case. But you can really get the two of them to have a strong rivalry against each other. And usually when there's exclusivity agreements that are in place, that's the reason why. So you might start off with something which is like, you can't sell to anyone except us. Like, well, that's not really like the right way to do it. You unpack that, and it could be that company A, who has this huge rivalry with company B, and you're like, okay, fine, I'm only going to work with the Oracle ecosystem or the IBM ecosystem, not one or the other. And as a result, you figure out that you can sell to a huge marketplace that's different, or you have to only give them the first right of refusal of the new products, or there's other ways that you can ask for things that kind of unravel or kind of get at that exclusivity. So you still have an exclusivity arrangement of some form or function, but it's really on what is the core interest that they're trying to protect.
Hello. So thanks for touring the edge of Europe. So I wanted to ask, what is your kind of pipeline of kind of investments that you are planning to, or you're looking to invest in Europe? You know, how many startups are you planning to speak over next year? How many investments are you planning to do? How much money have you maybe put aside for, let's say, European investment arm? So that's maybe question number one. And the question number two, so dual kind of use could be tricky to from a company, from a startup company to get, especially when it's hardware involved. You know, we don't see many kind of dual use ambulances, right, going around. It could be, you know, ambulances for military and ambulances for you know, just, you know, let's say city and municipalities. So what would be the top 3-5 dual use startups that are both software and hardware that you invested in, and how they bridged those two different chasms?
Yeah, in terms of our European plans, one of our 13 investments is based in Europe. You don't have a specific allocation that we're looking for, a certain percentage that are in Europe or not. On average, we're writing $1 million checks out of a $25 million fund. We'll probably do fund 2, maybe end of this year, maybe next year. So we don't have any specific per country quotas that we're trying to look for. In terms of the dual use, but we're curious. That's one of the reasons why we're here, and certainly the ecosystem development is one of the fascinating questions that I love working at, and there's some expertise here that we think is pretty interesting. In terms of dual use, some of it is like your example of ambulances, for example. You know, probably what I would say to that is that there's usually specific use cases that are, you could take the same product and apply it in two different worlds in a dual use aspect. So one of our companies is doing deep fake detection. So they're looking at, is this video, image, or audio, was it manipulated in some form or function? So corporates, very easy to understand. They don't want people on the news being able to upload content that's been doctored or modified. We talked about how there's a bunch of elections this year. Well, I mean, you want to make sure that if somebody's saying, "Oh, I concede the election," like you want to make sure that has a validity and integrity. So that really goes to identity. So that's an example of same technology, but its use case is very different. We have a company that's called Onsites, and they're doing computer vision as applied to people and things moving through spaces. And so the military intelligence applications are very different in terms of understanding the geography and how people or things are moving through that space, versus retail analytics. How are groups of people moving through malls, and what stores are they entering to get aggregated and non-person identifiable data tracking around, like this many people going to this store. So that's where we think that dual use is really advantageous, and not just the non-dilutive money, but the government does have some pretty interesting data sets, know-how. When I was working on Internet Things, we used to joke that there's about 300 people that know exactly how the internet runs. Government employs about 50 of them. And so not talking to government people, not understanding the way that they looked at those challenges and those problem sets, meant that there was a group of people that we would never get access to. And we thought of it as, there's different ways you have to learn how to unpack that engagement. I mean, we talked about that trust and building that trust. I mean, that was a multi-year process. I mean, it was a very, like, you could ask a question, but you wouldn't get an answer. Like, hey, so what'd you think of the last thing we shipped you? And they're like, oh yeah, you shipped it to us. I can confirm the date in which they shipped it. And it took years before we could get a place where, and I remember this, there was a specific project that they asked us to do, And we gave our analysis, and they had this manila folder with a sheet of paper inside of it, and they slid it across the table and said, hey, look inside of here. And like, you know, first question, where'd you get this? Like, no, it's not important. But it helped us provide a better and more complete answer. And we learned a variety of techniques through that made our product better. And so there were probably half a dozen of those stories that I remember that interaction, and it develops in a strange way over multiple years, but that trust building let Dime be a better company because of that interaction.
Hello, Jeremy. Thank you for this occasion to meet you, and it's very interesting that you have done something in defense area. In this case, I represent National Defense Industries Association in Lithuania, and we have companies that have their own products, and the question is then how to persuade engineering company, which consists of several key people, to go to investors to get investment when we talk about such kind of closed area as defense, where we don't want to disperse too much information, and when we cannot go to markets like Arab countries, China, etc.
First off, appreciate that, and please don't go talk to the Chinese or other people. And it's been fascinating because I've seen this in microelectronics actually, where there were a number of companies that maybe it was about 3 years ago, that they started to feel that they had to make choices between kind of Western and authoritarian world. And I'm happy they made the choices that they did, because they've by and large chosen Western economic democratic societies instead of autocratic societies. And so I'm again very thankful that Western ideals is appealing to more people than it's not. I think that there's a population, it's not a big population, but there's a population of venture capitalists and investors who will take time and they're willing to get to know people. And you know, at the risk of getting a flood of startups who are working in this space, I mean, I'm happy to talk with them. And I know that there's a few others. Earlier today, I showed a market map that we have of at least US-based venture capital firms that are defense focused. Some of them are defense only. And so they're very comfortable with things that are kinetic. They're very comfortable with all the secrecy aspects that go around it. And honestly, like a lot of stuff, and I say this, I'm not a clearance holder. I don't need to know a lot of those things. So again, like I don't need to know exactly how something works. I'm pretty gullible. But it's really easy to ask the questions around things of, like, are you actually solving problems? Do you have a specific contract? And some contracts obviously have some sensitivity about what they're doing. Some of our portfolio companies, some of their use cases that they have shared are sensitized, but I don't need to have a complete level of understanding. I can kind of figure out what they're doing. And again, that trust-based environment, I've probably seen or heard some things that have some sensitivities too that I'm discreet about. And that trust, I think, is one of those ones where people see you in those environments, and over time, like, oh, this person I can tell this thing to, and I know that it's not going to just go everywhere. And it takes time, and that capacity building around business development, around marketing, is one where it's capacity building that just takes multiple years. And whether that's defense-oriented companies or dual-use-oriented companies, I think that's something that, again, you'll find a population of people that are willing to help and answer those questions.
Thank you. Any more questions?
And look forward to dinner together tomorrow.
So I see no questions here in the room, so we can continue off the record discussion with some networking and drinks. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you everyone who came here in person. So let's continue our conversation, and I would encourage startups that you met already and that you will be meeting tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Leave a great impression so that we could have US defense funds co-investing with us. We have watching you, big guys, and there is already investment in the region, but not in Lithuania by this fund. So
you had to say that.
You have your chance. I'm not telling the country. The region is big.
Region is big.
Yeah, this half of the globe.
Yeah, and and one thing I would say is start the dialogue. It's not. The mistake is waiting until you think you are perfect. I think that your early stage startups, not everything's perfect. There's something on fire, there's something that's breaking, but there's some really great things that are happening. So share those great things, and we like to be part of the journey. So excited to get to learn and more, and I look forward to meeting you all.
Thank you. And also just one more encouragement to increase our company by getting a digital warrior. You will have a QR code next to our drinks, and we have a few remaining collectibles, unique of the kind cards with some artwork, which we presented, and we have one lucky buyer in this room when we were raising funds for Blue Yellow at our new strategy launch back in May. It's collectible. It has original signatures, including Jonas Oman. Jonas is with us today. So get yourself a soldier, and let's invest in innovations. And as I wrote in my slides, first we need to deter so that we will not need to defend. Ukrainians are defending us today. Thank you, everyone.